Like, because some people make goals early and never did this, but some people are like lift weights for a week and they're like, I want to be an IFBB pro. And you're like, but okay, that might be a thing,
sure, but
like, let's give it some time doing diligent stuff. And then we know, like, if you're well on your way, hey, shit, man, things are probably looking up. The topic of your PhD was the individual response to variation in resistance training. In non-sciencey terms, what does that mean?
Basically, I came into my PhD with, a good amount of coaching experience and intuition that people are different. And ultimately the way that they respond to training seemingly is very different. And ultimately, from a coaching perspective, the interventions that they would do the best with probably are also very different. And that was kind of the perspective I came into my PhD with. And I really wanted to find answers for people like us. What are some diagnostic criteria that I could know just from a gym perspective, whether that's a rep test or a vertical jump or whatever practical variables you could have to tell me, hey, if I have this sort of relationship, let's say I have a really good vertical jump.
Yes.
Maybe I'm a low volume person.
Yes.
And I would do better with that. Or let's say I have a really high number of reps to failure with like 70%. Maybe I'm a high volume person because of that. That's what I came into my PhD with, and a really strong coaching experience that was the case, intuition, all these kind of things. And throughout my process, my mind has changed a lot on kind of just how to investigate that question and ultimately what it means and how it ultimately drives practice. It's just changed a lot.
Yeah. So there are two extremes we can take in hypothesizing about the reality that you found and you coalesced to. They're both extremes, so they're both going to be totally insane, but we're all about directionality. So it's kind of like, okay, what combination of these or where are we lying on the spectrum?
Exactly.
One side of the spectrum is that basically your serum testosterone is the only proximate variable to determine how many gains you're going to get.
Yep.
You multiply that by moving weight around in the gym, multiply that by time and consistency, and you could explain 97% of the variance of why people are jacked.
Yep.
And if you're like, yeah, but this one exercise, or actually for me, the rep range, everyone's like, that's total bullshit. None of that matters. You're just excusing the fact that you have Harry Potter testosterone levels. Although, Scott, have we seen Daniel Craig lately? He's kind of fucking juiced up, huh? My man. Fuck Harry Potter. You had to get the wizard wand on your fucking. So that's one end.
Yeah.
You either got it or you don't got it.
Yep.
The other end, hypothetically, would be like, look, if someone isn't getting really great gains from training in a given program, there are many dials we can play with that don't subtly change the outcome, because we already know subtly that's true. Like, some people just get more out of lat pull downs than pull ups. That's not really up for debate.
Yep.
What's up for debate is like, how big of a deal is that?
Yeah.
Because if you tell someone who is like, they've trained for a while, they weigh 155, muscular, lean. And on the one end, you say like, just fucking keep training and you'll get up to 160, 165, et cetera. If you don't, it's just like, your genetics suck and there's just no way out of that.
Yeah.
The other extreme is like, look, if you take your grip on lat pull downs from overhand, you go to neutral, you do length and partials instead of full reps, not for everyone, but just for you, you're going to put slabs of beef on your lats that just straight up, you've been training with the basics for years. You make one change here and one change there and just explosive growth results. So those are the two extremes. One is like, you just train and shit just happens. It's not really up to you. The other one is like, there are so many dials to play with and all of them have big margins that really determine. So someone could look at your plan, look at your overall size and strength and be like, see, okay, your lat work, you're doing it on Tuesdays. We're going to move it to Thursdays. 3 months later, you're like, I can't fucking put my arms down anymore, bro.
Exactly.
So your research has found, let's say we put at 0 is the idea that you just fucking train and shit either happens or doesn't to whatever extent. And at 100, we put like every little nuance has big differences in outcomes. Exercise variation, exercise type, frequency, rep ranges. Like, I've trained for years with sets of 10, but as soon as I started doing sets of 20, my shit just blew up into the moon. That kind of idea. That's 100. Where did your research find a rough number? Super, and we understand it's a super guesstimate kind of stuff.
I think probably the most helpful way to answer it is that I came at it from the perspective that it was definitely on the positive side of 50. Definitely, mostly from like the primary training variable stuff. I think biomechanics is like a very separate class, and we can talk about that a little bit. I think that's like a unique situation here, that just a very basic example why that may matter. Machines and training studies are fixed apparatus, right? And my biomechanics may interface on that machine different than your biomechanics. So in some sense, the intervention isn't really standardized. If you just think about the range of motion in which the exercise is most challenging, if I have a leg extension machine and for whatever reason the segment lengths change where that exercise is the most challenging, in a roundabout way, you're not really comparing apples to apples.
Exercise.
There.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so that's where I think biomechanics is kind of separate.
Or you're just not using certain muscles that you're supposed to be and you think you are.
Yeah.
Right.
So I think
we'll take exercise. We'll take the biomechanics and a specific exercise execution out.
Let's put volume on the table.
Volume, proximity to failure.
Yeah.
Some guys like, I don't fuck with failure, but RIR is better for me. And we can use even rep ranges.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. That's another good one.
Exactly.
Like heavy works for me, light doesn't, or vice versa.
Yep.
Whereas the other view, the 0% view would be like, if you got that growth bullshit in you, you grow from light, you grow from heavy, you grow from moderate.
Yeah.
If you got that Harry Potter shit, then like good luck, because nothing's really going to move the dial. It might a little bit, but not much.
Yeah, exactly. So I came into my PhD and there, just using one study as an example, there's a study by Damas that basically did one of those within subject designs where one limb does one protocol, the other limb does another protocol. And they had participant level data, obviously. So, could look at kind of each participant's outcomes. And there appeared to be some outcomes.
Do you dox them? You send them an email like, hey,
like zip codes.
You suck.
And it appeared to be that, some participants would essentially have a limb that did their low volume limb, let's say, was like either lost muscle size or was like clearly no gain, but their high volume limb was above measurement error and it was like a really robust response, but then also vice versa. So coming into my PhD, that was like one of the bedrock foundations of like, hey, this is showing that people are having variable responses to training volume outside of what we would predict from a meta-analysis. A meta-analysis on average is going to say people are going to respond better with higher volumes, but that wasn't unanimously the case. Therefore, this seems to exist. Then I got awesome committee members on my PhD, much smarter than me, who introduced me to a lot of these concepts that make answering this question extremely, extremely challenging. And so let's paint this picture. I take that same individual that maybe did really, really well with high volumes and very poorly with low volumes. The hidden assumption there is that the difference between those two training protocols is greater than what if I had them repeat the exact same training protocol 10 times in a row? And what is the variability I would see repeating that exact same training program? And if we look at the research that we do have, and we can go through kind of each ones of those, that variability just generally to a given training program seems to exceed the differences. And so ultimately what you're saying there is that the differences that we do see between these two training protocols may simply just be that time they responded a little bit lower or a little bit higher, but not necessarily due to the interventions themselves. And so it's really kind of a esoteric thing to kind of think about, but
signal versus noise.
Bingo. And so if we look at some of the research that we do have on this, that's like meta-analysis, a lot of studies, a lot of participants, it's limited, not perfect, but it probably is our best look at it. We basically have a ton of resistance training versus control studies. And so you have tons of groups that are performing resistance training and tons of control groups who are not performing any training at all.
It's the easy part of the study.
Exactly. If you were expecting to see these wide variations in outcomes, the variability in the gains in muscle size, the gains in strengths that you see from these resistance training groups should exceed that of a control group, right? A control group should be very tightly clustered around 0, and you wouldn't expect very much variability. But because of things like measurement error, biological variability, just a basic example, like people's carbohydrate intake may change and you get some fluid retention, random stuff like that. Mm-hmm. That's what a control group's going to
growth
proxy.
And maturation.
Yeah, exactly.
In college.
Yeah. And I think maturation's another, let's stick 18 plus because that's another tough one. But those control groups should be relatively tightly clustered around 0, but they're going to have some variability because of those things we just mentioned. You compare that to the resistance training groups, which have all of those same variables, plus the variability, presumably, from the training intervention.
Different response between like I respond to low versus high.
Or just resistance training broadly in this case. So like some people do really well, some people do really poorly. Right. So the expectation would be, hey, these groups that are training should have this additional source of variability. And when we compare them, we would expect the resistance training group to be more. It's actually the opposite. And that's what's just really, really counterintuitive from that perspective, to say, man, this variability that we expect to be there doesn't really seem to be there. And so I think from that perspective, that kind of is the first thing you kind of turn your eye up and say, oh, this is a little bit counterintuitive. But when you think about it from that perspective, you can kind of look at other pieces of data that kind of paint a similar picture. We have a couple studies that, one common response to that may be like, okay, maybe it's selection bias or the length of studies that we have. Maybe there's not enough time to have these manifestation of divergent responses, or maybe it's the people that are in the studies. There's two really big data sets from one of my committee members, Dr. Steele, that
What a sweet name.
Oh yeah, he's got a cool name. I wish I could steal it. But he has one study that basically followed people. I can't remember exactly how long of it, but it's a very long time period, like on the order of years, in terms of their strength trajectory. Once again, over that length of a time, you would expect these patterns to diverge, and the variability there doesn't seem to be massive either. And then some data,
so
like
everyone kind of is on a similar trajectory. Just some people, it's a higher curve. With some people, it's a lower curve, but the shape of the curve is pretty similar.
Yeah.
Everyone starts out getting a lot of strength at the beginning, then a little bit less, and a little bit less, and a little bit less.
And the thing that's substantially different between people is kind of where they start. Now, people may hear that and say, oh, okay, so I'm just beholden to my genetics. And I definitely don't think that's the takeaway. But ultimately, what I think this has opened my eyes to, and my dissertation project is kind of a similar vein, is ultimately that it makes it not as complicated than try to like look for a magic bullet. And I actually think it makes the things that we can take from research, these directional principles that we've been talking about, more helpful. Because if I am an individual that just completely diverges away from what we understand about the directional principles of physiology on average, research isn't helpful at all. If
Sure.
At any point in time that I can be completely different from the crowd, things get more challenging to utilize those things and ultimately help it inform my training. So I think it simplifies things, and it ultimately helps us hone in on these basic principles that likely are going to operate for most people on average. And the thing that's going to change the actual numbers that you're training with, the volumes, the proximity to failures, the rep ranges, are the kind of these environmental constraints that we were kind of talking about, in addition to preference and some other things like biomechanics and stuff that we mentioned. So to me, at first glance, it's like, okay, we all seemingly have similar training effects. Once we start training, the gains that we have seem to be relatively similar. That seems like a defeatist kind of thing, but to me, it's ultimately just simplifies things a lot to say, we don't have to look for magic bullets. It's probably the same general principles that apply to pretty much everyone. If I focus on those, I'm going to get the benefits that we think training has. And then the last thing I'll say is, like, I'm in no way saying that there's no variability that exists. Very clearly, every time we try to quantify this, it's non-zero. It's just in comparison to the way that I came into my PhD thinking about it. And I think most people kind of talk about that variability. I think they often, and I did the same thing, missed kind of this pretty big limitation of looking at just like individual data points and seeing a scatter of individual data points and saying that, boom, there it is, very individual rates of response. I don't think you can do that. And I think you have to go about it a very particular way to be informing the actual magnitudes of like variation that we would actually see.
So they regress to the mean, basically. So your initial guess roughly was 0 being nothing matters, just fucking lift. 100 being everyone's their magical special snowflake. No one program could explain everything.
Yeah.
Your initial guess might have been like 75.
Yeah.
And your current estimate is more like 25.
Bingo. Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
That makes sense. So the takeaway from that is like, look, so insofar as you can recover, training closer to failure is probably better than training further failure. Doing more volume is probably better than doing less volume. Getting a recovery aligned and getting more sleep, et cetera, is probably better than less sleep, so on and so forth. So the basics kind of apply to everyone. And there are nuances. People are different in a way that matters.
Yep.
But to me, one of the big takeaways is, if you are arranging your training program after years of training, rearranging it for better gains, what you should expect is like, dude, I can make some fucking better gains with this. What you shouldn't expect is like, I'm going to be Ronnie Coleman next week. Now, I know this is an exaggeration, but like, I'm going to get categorically totally different gains. Possible, but less likely.
And I think it's still like, to me, it still puts the onus on the training program that you're utilizing and still like rewards effort, because ultimately the kind of, although the theoretical rate of progress may be similar among people, that doesn't mean that better training isn't better training. It still is. And so adhering to better training for a long period of time and iterating upon that to make sure that your strategy is sustainable for your external context, like your biomechanics, and then just, again, optimizing within your own individual constraints, there's still a lot of individualization that's occurring within that. It's just maybe not from this theoretical physiological perspective, which was really the sector of the pie that my PhD was focused on. I think the practical end of things is honestly relatively similar. It just eliminates maybe the confusion of searching for like a magic bullet.
Yes.
And I think that simplifies things, and it rewards, just focusing on the big rocks that you're ultimately putting your effort towards and modulating those relative to the constraints that you're optimizing towards.
Yes.
So I think it isn't in any way defeatist in my mind. It still rewards good training. It's not like you're beholden to just, okay, I'm going to get what I get no matter if I do, one set of one session per week or whatever. It's not that at all. It's just saying that, the training effects may be relatively similar among people. There might be a little bit of variability, but that's probably been overestimated in the past. And I just got to do the things that probably generalize across people for the most part. And that's going to help me out the most in the end. And there's still these things I'm going to have to manipulate for a variety of different reasons that are going to allow me to reach that in a 10 to 20 year time span. Because if I quit training after 5 years, I'm never manifesting that growth that I'm theoretically capped in, right? The people that quit training because they don't have a sustainable recipe for the things that they're doing are never going to reach the theoretical cap to that response rate that we may think exists.
Right. But at the same time, just a few percentage points better per year than what you were otherwise doing has an accumulative effect that's like pretty impressive. Yeah. So 5% better over 10 years is like some kind of absurd number. Yeah. So over time, it does add up. But if you change your program in the short term and expect just like 3 months later to get radically different results, like we already know that's not likely. Yeah. And the reason we're saying isn't actually to bring people down. No. The reason we're saying it is reverse in my mind.
100%.
It is we're trying to liberate you from unrealistic expectations.
Exactly. Yes.
Because if you think, oh, fuck, this new dumbbell press variation is going to be everything. It's hashtag goals or whatever. And it doesn't make things way better, but a little bit better. You're like, dude, this sucks. Like, no. This is what you should have been expecting. Yeah. And it's a set of principles that's so true in many other applications. Like if you're, like let's say you're a guy who's on the dating market and you're looking at like, what outfit should I wear to this date? Yeah. Somebody who knows a little bit about dating, not me, this is red pill shit I've read on the internet, can tell you like, look, if you go in an awesome outfit versus a clown show outfit, you're going to see some differences in response from your date. She's going to be like more or less into you. But if you think that the outfit you're wearing can mess on the same order of a variable of like how chill you are, like if you're a douche, and you're like, yeah, but I got a 3-piece suit on, like that ain't it. Now it's better to be a douche in a 3-piece suit than be a douche in like sweatpants on a date. Right. Oh, there we go. But it's just the thing you think has these huge carryovers actually has quite small ones. That doesn't mean they're not real. Yeah. And if you arrange all the small variables in your program well over time by learning yourself and being available to the literature, by watching more podcasts like this, am I right? Scott, am I right? Yeah. Then you can make meaningful differences versus the alternate universe version of you that was like, just fuck it, lift. Yeah. We're not saying just fuck it, lift.
No, not at all.
We're saying that you can make changes, but the changes are kind of like if you get a Honda Civic, you want to race, you tune up the engine, you can tune up the computer, you can get different tires, and that will make it go faster. Yeah. But there's not a road to the Lamborghini there. You just have to get a fucking Lambo. Which I think is
self-evident. Right?
Self-evident. Like everyone kind of knows it in training. Like if you start out with 100 pounds soaking wet and over the first several years of your training doing it, and this is what I tend to say often, people are like, how do I know what my genetics are? But you got to cram in several years of what I call a diligent effort. Your sleep better be right. Cause like if your sleep sucks, that actually is a big unlock, huge unlock. Yeah, exactly. If your nutrition is there, you're eating enough to supply enough protein. If you're training diligently and consistently and reasonably, whatever your trajectory is after 3 years gives you some decent insight on what it will continue to be in the future. So if in the first 3 years you did the Jay Cutler thing where he gained like 50 pounds of muscle in 1 year, like it's unlikely that's just going to stop.
Yeah.
Some satellite cell bullshit, maybe in some cases, but not likely. Whereas like, because some people make goals early and never did this, but some people are like lift weights for a week and they're like, I want to be an IFBB pro. And you're like, but okay, that might be a thing, but like, let's give it some time doing diligent stuff. And then we know like, if you're well on your way, hey shit, man, things are probably looking up. But if it's like you gained 5 pounds of muscle over the course of 3 years of like really trying, and everyone has looked at your program as like, doesn't seem to be anything missing to me. You might have some unlocks that get you another 5 pounds even in the next year. Oh my God, it's 3 times the rate. Unbelievable. But it's unlikely that an unlock will get you 20 pounds of muscle in that next year. Is that seemingly like...
And I like to think about it from like a training variable perspective. I just think that makes it the most concrete is like, ultimately the implication here is that like, let's say we have this, or even the proximity to failure one we just described, let's say we have this kind of linear relationship that we think is kind of the population average, or maybe a manifestation of how we think physiology works. Basically the implication is that I don't necessarily think that's going to differ too much per person.
Right. Everyone benefits from going closer to failure if they can recover.
Exactly. And the thing that's going to...
Almost everyone.
Right. The thing that's going to manifest that differently in an applied case are those environmental constraints and then some of the other like weird factors like biomechanics, maturation. There's kind of weird camps, but it may just like cut off where is like a practically reasonable place to land on that curve. Whereas, but it doesn't mean that the rest of the curve doesn't still exist. It just means that in your given applied scenario, because your sleep sucks, your nutrition sucks, whatever, this may be this is the most
volume you can do.
Exactly. But that doesn't mean more volume in a theory might not be a little bit more beneficial.
And in practice, if you fix your sleep and et cetera,
then you might be able to handle more. Exactly.
100%.
Exactly. So I think that's, to me, again, it just makes it so that as a coach, think about the alternative. Like, okay, let's say that every single person's fundamental like laws of physiology operate entirely differently. That's like the extreme I like to think on the other end of the scenario. I would literally need to try a hypertrophy program that does 1 set per week, 2 sets per week, 3, 4, 5, 30, 20.
You get non-linear gains where like at 3 sets per week, you get infinity gains, but at 4 you lose all of your muscle. And then at 5 you gain some of it back, but not all.
And that's obviously like, it's an extreme analogy, but like, that's kind of what the implication is in the alternate scenario is that like, yes, I realize
it's like solving a puzzle.
Exactly. Physiology is really complex and we have all these kind of feedback loops in both a positive and negative direction that makes things maybe less intuitive. But I think at the heart of it, I would surmise that like these general principles are probably relatively similar between people. The other example I like to think about in my brain, and this is where like almost all of this research actually exists, is like medicine. Like precision medicine is like a very big topic. And if anybody's interested in this topic, I would very much encourage going down that rabbit hole of reading, because it's absolutely fascinating in terms of, that's like a really hyped up thing, but from a statistical perspective, it gets really, really complicated and doesn't seem to be super strong evidence for it. But ultimately, like blood pressure medication, just as like a basic example. If I take blood pressure medication, my blood pressure is probably going to go down. It might go down to a different degree based on my diet and some of these other like systematic factors that vary alongside me taking the medication. But is it likely that I actually will increase my blood pressure of taking the medication? That seems unlikely.
Even though the receptors are the same in rats and in like C. elegans worm, and you're like, I don't think we invented a new class of receptor, evolved in just my family tree.
Yeah. So like that's kind of where my brain goes in terms of like just thinking about it on the extremes, and the fact that people are likely more similar rather than different tends to align with me. But the thing that they're very different is socioeconomic status, occupation, sleep, recovery, nutrition, all these other things that are just completely variable between people that may allow any given set of training variables to either be sufficient or insufficient based on the external factors. But that doesn't change these principles that we all kind of accept as generally true and have evidence to support, if that makes sense.
So the really quick summary is get your basics right of good hardcore training, enough volume, good technique, enough proximity to failure, fill that cup. Make sure your lifestyle variables are just not stupid. Like, if I haven't slept in 3 days, like, okay, I don't know what your association with lifting is, but it's currently 0. fix all that nutrition, sleep, etc. And then absolutely do play with the finer margins of, are sets of 5 to 10 better for me? Is it sets of 10 to 15 in this exercise, so on and so forth? But understand that once you have your basics, that's like 75% of the thrust of the rocket.
Yeah.
And then the other stuff is just like the fins move and you just change a little bit where the rocket goes.
I wouldn't expect that to be, like you said, lead to night and day differences. It might lead to, meaningful differences in some cases versus others. We could speculate whether those are like true physiological reasons or maybe implications due to some of these other environmental factors, but practically it doesn't matter.
Sure.
It's still kind of these individual decisions that you're making that seem to allow you to sustain more training over time, train a little bit closer to failure, do better exercises. All those kind of things still apply. And it doesn't really matter the reason you're getting there. It's just, there really are no magic bullets. I think that's really the concept that to me hits home the hardest, and that I don't need to go do some very wacky training program because I think it's going to uniquely fit my physiology. The training programs that are going to work are probably going to follow the basic principles, probably going to operate in the same direction of these directional principles we've discussed. And yeah, there's sure there might be some areas that I'd like to tweak or change.
And
for
it's
preference.
good to do that.
100%. And even just from like a variability and enjoyment perspective of training for 10 to 20 years, like I said, the only way you get to
just
reach
pull-ups, bro.
Yeah, exactly. The only way you get to reach that rate of progress is if you actually sustain good training for that long. So you have to do those things for a variety of different reasons. And I think just understand there's no magic bullets. I think it reinforces that the basic principles are matter and gives people, a little bit of sense of ease. You don't have to like go look for these weird solutions to think that that's the reason you're not making progress. Just put your effort and your mindset towards the basic principles and adjusting those relative to your constraints. And I think that's the secret sauce. It's not, some weird.
Exactly 17 reps.
Exactly.